Some days in the course of one's life, it's necessary to reflect on special people who have touched your life. One of those people, for me, was a woman named Carolyn McCool. And this week, I learned of her death from another dear friend, Greene. And so I'm going to do my best to share a remembrance of Carol today. This is how I remember her. Carolyn was a member of my senior class in high school in Yokohama, Japan. And it's going to be a bit complicated to explain what she meant to me and to the world. And so since she passed away a year and a half ago, I was unaware of her death. And this week, another dear friend, Greene, sent me her obituary, which I'm going to share with you here for a few moments so that you can read about her. Carolyn, among other things, late in her life, became the head, besides serving in Kosovo, as a director for safety and let's see what else. Director of the UN Organization of Safety and Cooperation in Europe, serving in Kosovo. She later went on to Afghanistan, where she was the leader of the UN Organization for Women, or UN Development Fund for Women, which is called UNIFEM. And so she was an incredibly courageous woman. But an obituary, hi, Gray. This is going to be a reminiscence, so it's going to be a little bit weepy, I'm afraid. So an obituary of a person is pure logos. It's, a lot of words, and you read about that person, and then you go on with your life. And so somehow I want to express the eros part of my life, and how Carolyn McCool touched it. And for that, I have to go back to 1962 and introduce you to my dearest friend in life. And this video is not going to be about him, but because he has touched my life throughout, and including in this week, since I received the obituary of Carolyn from him, I have to share a bit of his story as well. So in January of 1962, my family got on an airplane and flew to Japan, where my father was going to be stationed for the next 3 years. And I was 15 years old at the time. Actually, No, I was 14 years old at the time. And I arrived in Japan knowing very little about it. I had seen the black and white war movies of our war with Japan, and that was about all I knew. And on and my school, the school that I attended in high school, was in Yokohama. And at the end of World War II, the building in which I went to high school was the only building left standing. Every other building in the city of Yokohama had burned. And our school building was made of stucco and concrete. And so it had survived because it was a hospital and it had a Red Cross that was painted on the top of it during the war. And the way we passed from one floor to another of this building to go to our different classes in high school were actually ramps, which they had used for the gurneys in this hospital during the war. And on my first day of school, I was feeling rather introverted, as I have always been through my life. And I was sitting quietly in my French class, and suddenly I was hit on the side of my face by a spitball. And I looked up, and here was this man, Ray Greene, who was then himself 14, too, and he had sought to get my attention. And so ever since then, Ray has been my dear friend. And this is not going to be about Ray, but you have to know something about him to understand this relationship. So Ray, so in any case, this is really about Carolyn McCool. And so I want to definitely share with you again her obituary so that you can pay some attention to that, because we had a special experience together in Japan and also in 2003 that I'm going to share with you today. So Carolyn wasn't in my school at the time that I met Ray, but in my senior year, which started a year and a half later, she came in, and she was this beautiful blonde young woman, and I'm sure she stole the hearts of every young man in my class. When everyone first saw her, she was blonde and quite attractive and quite vivacious and full of life. And so she's always had a piece of my anima ever since. And so, but my interactions with her have been relatively few. She's just a remarkable woman. She was never my girlfriend because I already had a girlfriend when she appeared on the scene. And so a couple of unique things about our high school class. Our senior class dinner was scheduled for November 23rd, 1963. And you're going to think that that was the day after JFK was shot, but actually it was the day JFK was shot, because he was shot at 3 o'clock in the morning, Japan time, on the 23rd of November. And on that day, my father woke me up early in the morning and said that the president had been shot, and killed. And I didn't know what to do about that. I was a senior in high school in Japan, but my father said that he was going into the naval station in Yokosuka, where he was stationed, and that he wouldn't be back for a few days. And that was because the entire armed forces of the United States assumed Defense Condition 3 at that time. And my father literally was gone for 3 days. And I had planned to spend the day in Yokohama in preparation for this class dinner, so didn't know what to do or not do, so I decided to take a train into Yokohama, and of course found that the president had been shot, and I was staying with Ray Greene that day at his home, and some of us had gotten together. One of them was Carolyn, and our dinner was canceled for that day. We had it later on not quite such an emotional occasion. But anyway, we just to fast forward this a little bit, we graduated from high school on the 22nd of May, 1964. And my class of 72, one other thing that is important to mention about Carolyn was that the day she arrived, I had told my father that there was this beautiful girl who had joined our class, and I told him her name, and her name, Carolyn McCool. My father said, McCool, I thought he got his balls shot off. Now, my father had gone to the Naval Academy with Richard McCool, and Richard McCool had won the Congressional Medal of Honor in World War II. So Richard McCool had graduated from the Naval Academy in May of 1944, a year ahead of my father, had gone to the Pacific, had participated in the Battle of Okinawa. His ship was hit by a Japanese kamikaze plane, and it was sinking. And Richard McCool went down into the engine room of his ship, and though it was on fire, he saved the lives of 10 of his fellow crew members. He literally carried them up out of the engine room on his back and got them into life rafts. And he was burned over, if I recall correctly, over 70% of his body was terribly burned. And he was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for his service. And but we think of courage like that, and we don't realize that that courage has a price. And Richard McCool, because of the pain that he suffered throughout the rest of his life from his terrible burns, was an alcoholic, and he was abusive to Carolyn. And Carolyn had come into her own by the time she got to senior year, because she was resisting his alcoholism. And so that, I'm sure, steeled her for what was to come later, because, as I said, her last major service for the United Nations was as head of the UN Development Fund for Women in Afghanistan. And the reason she was able to get that job, it wouldn't have been a job that an American would typically get, but after she married, in her first marriage, her husband brought her to Canada, and ultimately she became a Canadian citizen and a very prominent lawyer in Vancouver. And I didn't know of her for many years. In fact, I had completely lost track of her. And that was true of all of my classmates. My class were, because we were the children of naval officers, when we graduated from high school, we went to the Winds. And in the 30 years that passed after our high school graduation, I only saw one person, and that was a woman named Diana Sherman, who was also in class, but I know her brother climbed Mount Fuji with me for Earth. And his name was Vining Sherman. But one of my classmates in 1994, named Dana Beckman, to his great credit, pulled out what was then known as the White Pages, the American White Pages, which at that time we didn't have Google. And so, but there were CD discs of basically people's telephone numbers all over the United States. And so he found as many members of our class as he could. And he found actually 5 years worth of graduates from our high school, which was called now C. Kinnick Navy Dependent Junior High School of Yokohama, but was affectionately called Yohai. And so Dana found many of us and invited us all to a reunion in Glenwood Springs, Colorado. And 200 of us came from 5 different classes. Mine was the oldest class, I think, that attended, although there was one member of the class of 63, I think. But in any case, we went to Glenwood Springs, and it was at that time that on the Saturday night we were going to have a sock hop like in high school. And after the sock hop, I was in bed with my wife and I just started to weep. And I realized at that time that I had been in love with all the girls, not only Carolyn, but all. But there was an interesting experience with Ray, because Ray was I think the one member of our class that went to Canada during the Vietnam War. And I had not seen him for 30 years. I had spoken to him in 1967 when he decided to go to Canada, but then my life got busy and I lost track of him. And even though he and I, during high school, had done a lot of things together, we had gone on ski trips. Here were two 16, 17-year-old kids who were leading other kids on ski trips up in the mountains of Japan. And we knew that it was safe, though, and I particularly knew that on the day of Kennedy's assassination, because when I was on the train going to Yokohama, I saw practically everyone in the train was weeping, and they all had German or Japanese newspapers, and they were looking at the article about Kennedy, and Kennedy's picture was in the article, so I could see that they were all reading about this as an assassination. And I saw so many Japanese that were weeping as they read the article. And so from that moment, I knew that the stereotypical image that I had had of Japan, that Japan had been at war with my country. But I at that moment, I knew that World War II was over, really. And I knew how small the world was. So anyway, I hadn't seen Ray for 30 years, and he was scheduled to come to Glenwood Springs, but he had to drive. And Ray, basically, when he went to Canada, he became a woodsman. And there's so many interesting stories about Ray Greene, I couldn't even begin to tell you. But as he was coming to Glenwood Springs, he had a late start, and it was a 24-hour drive for him because he lived in Nakusp, N-A-K-U-S-P, Nakusp, British Columbia. And so as he was driving along, this was before people had cell phones, he was stopping at payphones, and he was calling one of our other friends at the hotel named Steve Swigert. He was calling him every several hours to say where he was on his drive. And Steve would come into the group and he'd say, "Oh, well, Ray's at such and such a place," and so on and so on. And so there was great anticipation for Ray to join us. And it was just fascinating to watch what happened, because when Ray arrived, all the attention came to him. If you're familiar with the song Quinn the Eskimo, where Bob Dylan talked about when Quinn arrives, all the pigeons will fly to him. And that's exactly what happened on that occasion with Ray. So Ray came into into a large lounge that we had at this hotel in Glenwood Springs, and immediately all of our class members formed around him and sat cross-legged in front of him. And Ray started to talk about his life, and it was quite clear that Ray was a shaman. And there were 2 hours of just rapt attention, at least 2 hours, maybe longer, rapt attention. And we all reconnected with Ray spiritually at that time. And after that time, I've been able to communicate with Ray almost certainly every week, if not every day, almost every day, on email and various kinds of social networking. Ray now lives in northern Vancouver Island, still in British Columbia, and he's still quite an outdoorsman. And so over the years, Ray and I communicated, and at one point he had run into Carolyn in at a courthouse and connected back up with her, and none of us had seen her for more than 30 years, and all of a sudden there she was. And so Ray told me about that, and we had various communications. And at one point in 2003, we decided we should get together. Ray and Carolyn and me and my wife Debbi and Penny Dewar, who is Ray's wife. And that's not easy because Ray lived 32 kilometers south of Nakusp, British Columbia, on the wrong side of the Columbia River, 14 kilometers up a logging road. And just a little bit about that. Ray's road where he lived was a single lane road, and it was designed for logging trucks to bring trucks off the mountains above him. And what they would do was they would put 3 logs on a flatbed truck and they would drag 3 behind them. And because it was the wrong side of the Columbia River, they had to take a ferry over to the main road to get the logs to market. And the road was marked with kilometer numbers so that you knew how high you were on this logging road. And Ray lived at marker number 14, but the markers went up probably to 45 or 50, I guess. And so you had to have a radio if you were going to drive that road, and every kilometer marker you had to announce where you were on this road, because the logging trucks would come down and they couldn't stop. They couldn't stop all the way to the ferry. And so if they were coming down and they say, you know, they're at marker 9 or whatever it was, and you were driving up, you would have to find a place to pull off the road so that this truck coming down could stop. And so up at Ray's, so anyway, up at Ray's house, Ray raised sheep, among other things, and that's an entirely different reminiscence and story. But Ray and Penny, among other things, generated their own electricity. Now, you would think that this would be some sort of plant or something like that, but actually there was a mountain stream, not very big, about this wide, and on that mountain stream Ray had put a funnel that went down through a hose, and it came out at this little tiny generator that was about maybe this big, and that generator was put in front of this water coming out through this hose, and it had this high-pitched screech like zzz, and that was enough electricity to run Ray's house with electricity, just like any modern home, actually. And So anyway, we decided we would meet Carolyn, and we were going to, my wife and I were going to Vancouver. I forget what the occasion was, but we decided to drive from Vancouver over to see Ray and spend the weekend with him. And so we invited Carolyn along, and so she met us in Kelowna, British Columbia. She took the train from Vancouver, met us in Kelowna, and we drove up to Ray's house, which was quite an experience. And so Ray also lives with someone who's another shaman. Penny Dewar is his wife. And Penny did this painting of the scene looking south on the Columbia River from their home. And it was just breathtaking, as you can see. And Penny is just an amazing mystic in her own right. Ray and Penny are both mystics of special value to me, especially. And Penny on that trip gave me this painting, which now hangs in my powder room, and I see it every day and think of this weekend that we had together every day. So we picked up Carolyn and we went up to Ray's house, which I called the Magic Mountain. And the reason I did was that weekend I have no real recollection of the weekend itself. But I know that there was a special bond made among the five of us on that trip. And so I call that our trip to the Magic Mountain. And Carolyn was an important part of that. And so, I don't know, two of my friends, my other girlfriends from that time, still share text messages with me every day. And they've said to me in the last day or two that Carolyn is just beyond the veil. And I know that she is just as much with me today as she has ever been. I mean, I've only been in her presence. I did see her one other time in Vancouver a couple of years after that. And she made me dinner at her home one evening. And I think I did meet her son then. But anyway, I've been talking about my friend Carolyn McCool. So once again, I'm going to share her photograph. This is sort of my memories of her. This is how I remember her from high school. And this is her official obituary, which was carried in the Vancouver papers, but I didn't know about it until this week, even though she died a year and a half ago. And so I hope that I've put a little bit of myself and my own sense and sensitivity about my friend Carolyn McCool in this video. And as I say, she still occupies a piece of my anima even today. And so she's a very special person. And yeah, one other story about Carolyn is that when her father died, perhaps 10 years ago, she was unable to come to Annapolis to attend the funeral, or let's see. I'm sorry, maybe she did attend, but because her father had won the Congressional Medal of Honor and was a Naval Academy graduate, and because I live 2 miles from the Naval Academy here, my wife, Debbi, was able to attend the funeral. And it was a complete full honors funeral, very much like the funeral you would have seen for John McCain. And then his ashes were buried in the columbary at the Naval Academy. So we've had a connection. I think Carolyn had been unable to attend that event, and so Debbi was able to attend as my representative because it happened that I was, I think I was in Pakistan, believe it or not, when that happened. But anyway, unfortunately, I missed his funeral. But I'm certainly happy for his life and a lifelong connection to Carolyn McCool. So thank you for listening. I think of this as kind of a in memoriam to Carolyn. So I'll try to get myself together and maybe I can read a little more of the Red Book a little later. Thank you for joining me today. All I have to do is figure out how to turn this off.